Are you that guy that asks in every freestyler's comment sections what camera settings they use? Are you just starting out of the game and want to know how to configure your settings? Are you willing to listen to me ramble about camera settings for like 15 minutes? If you said yes to any of these questions, then this video is for you. Default camera settings are bad, and it's especially important that you find good ones that you like. Camera settings are an important part of gameplay, and hopefully here, I can help you understand what each setting actually means and find which settings are right for you. The Camera Presets tab is a drop-down menu that reveals selectable presets. If you don't have Bak's mod, then you'll be stuck with the default presets the game provides for you. These are mostly useless, but the wide-angle camera preset isn't that bad for comp. If you have Bak's mod though, then you can add presets by editing the files under this file directory. When camera shake is enabled, your camera physically shakes and pans slightly when you hit the ball, jump, or do pretty much anything. A practical use for this has yet to be found, and it's generally thought of as a novelty. This is usually the first thing people tell you to turn off when you start playing the game. This is the second thing people usually tell you to change when you start playing Rocket League. If you take nothing else away from this video, turn this setting all the way up and turn camera shake off. Changing the field of view essentially makes the range your camera can view wider or smaller. Lowering your FOV is used to trim useless parts of the screen, and increasing it will give you more sense of speed. Also, lowering your distance and increasing your FOV gives you better depth perception. Even though using FOV higher than 110 would be better for competitive gameplay, Psyonix didn't add it since they deemed it didn't look very good. It's not super useful for freestyling because the extra space isn't usually necessary. If you want the advantages of having a higher FOV than 110, there are two options. Cheat Engine is one option to change the value of the camera settings by editing the memory of the game. These values will also be preserved across loads. Another option to get a higher FOV is by using a wider resolution. The FOV represents the horizontal field of view in terms of degrees on a 16:9 monitor. This means when you increase the monitor width, then you can see more on the sides of your screen. Distance controls the horizontal distance from a stationary car when using zero angle. Lowering your distance will give you slightly better control and better depth perception, but at the cost of limited visibility, similar to FOV. Lowering this can be good because the lower your distance is, the better you will be able to see the exact spot where you're hitting the ball. With that being said, I wouldn't recommend going too low for a few reasons. The first reason is that with too low of a distance, aesthetics will be compromised and they won't look as good overall. The second reason is that your competitive viability will be compromised since your awareness will be worse the closer you go. The third reason is that lowering your distance won't change how good your mechanics are for the most part. Your skill won't change if you increase your distance. All you have to do is take some time to get used to the extra distance. Height is by far the most important camera setting, and changing this can completely change the way the camera settings will feel. Changing this setting makes the cameras higher or lower regardless of distance. This setting goes hand in hand with angle. The height setting defines the baseline height of your camera above your car's center of mass when using zero angle. When the ball is above you, the camera will go lower, but it will be through a changing angle, which means that it will pivot around the center of your car. That's why air dribblers use low height, because they want to see under the ball. This is what air dribbling looks like with 100 height, and this is what it looks like with 50. I would say using 60 or less height is optimal for air dribbles, but 70 is usable. Also, upping your height too much can lead to a bad bouncing effect for resets, where instead of the ball moving on your screen, it's the car that's moving. Most good resetters use a lower height to see more below the ball and avoid this. Another thing that's useful to know about height is that when you're in ball cam with the ball and car both grounded, the closer you get to the ball, the higher your camera will go. Your angle will remain unchanged. One thing worth noting is that using different cars can make cameras look higher or lower. Using a flat car like a Batmobile will make the cameras look higher than if you're in a Merc, for example. One cool fact about camera setting height, if you have your split screen set to horizontal, playing in split screen will remove 40 height from your camera settings. Unfortunately, since it squishes your screen, it reduces your vertical field of view to much less than it normally would be. The angle is just the degree angle your camera is pivoted about the center of your car, which changes the vantage point you get on your car. Increasing the magnitude of your angle pivots the camera to be positioned higher. This can give a lot of extra height to camera settings that would otherwise be positioned very low. Angle has some effect on resets and air dribbles, but nowhere near as much as distance or height, so you can change it more freely without affecting how good the cams are. While height can completely change the way resets feel, angle just makes it a bit bouncier, like your camera is nodding. The main issue with changing to a high angle is that you won't be able to see as much of the top of your screen. I noticed that I got used to this after using high angle for a while. Another thing that's useful to know is that when you move without your wheels touching the ground in car cam, your angle slowly diminishes until it's the same as zero angle. In the previous versions of the game, the angle used to go down to -45 instead of being limited to -15. Lowering stiffness does two things. The first effect is that it increases your distance proportionally to your car's speed away from the camera. When you're going at supersonic with zero stiffness, your distance will increase by 115. And when you're going more than 1,000 unreal units per second towards the camera, your distance will decrease by 50 and stop there. The second thing it does is that it gives your camera a certain amount of inertia. This effect only occurs in car cam. This means that when in car cam, the camera lags behind a little bit, on top of the first effect, which increases distance. Lowering your stiffness will make clips look cleaner and give you a better aesthetic. With that being said, it makes your control worse as you feel less locked into the ball. It should be noted that since when you're in ball cam, stiffness only changes distance, low stiffness cams will act nearly the same as high stiffness cams when freestyling at low speeds. You can get used to it to a point where you barely even notice the low stiffness. Another thing stiffness is useful for is detecting whether you've got a reset. If you're using one stiffness and you're in car cam, catching a reset will make your camera snap into place. Swivel speed affects the speed at which your camera swivels when you look around with your right stick. When you aren't touching your camera swivel buttons, then this setting changes nothing. One useful thing about this is that when you press your camera swivel up, it makes your camera go lower. This is useful for air dribbles as it lets you air dribble with some camera height settings that would otherwise not be viable. Another thing you can do with swivel is bind your camera swivel to a mouse direction to have your camera permanently looking in that direction. Swivel doesn't work the exact same way as angle because things like flying in car cam will diminish your angle over time, yet the effect swivel has on your camera's pitch will remain. Also, when the ball is above you in ball cam, swivel down will point your camera down, while a high angle will still point to face the ball. No matter how far your camera is swiveled, you won't go below the floor on a standard map. Transition speed changes the time it takes to toggle between ball cam and car cam. Your frame rate may affect what you want to use, because if you use a low frame rate and your camera swivels too fast, it'll look choppy. There's not a ton to say about this, so just change it to whatever gives you enough field information when toggling between them without it feeling too sluggish. You can also take the other approach of making your transition instant so you have no delay between switching cams. This setting makes the controls listed under bindings into lies. With invert swivel enabled, the camera swivel up bind will actually swivel your camera down and vice versa. To my knowledge, this setting is useless. This setting exists under control settings. All it does is, instead of pressing a button to toggle ball cam, you hold a button to keep ball cam on. I believe this is a remnant of SART BC, the prequel to Rocket League, where you had to hold a button for ball cam. Reverse cam also exists, and I think it's worth mentioning briefly. It acts just like car cam but in the reverse direction. It's pretty straightforward, but there are a couple of interesting things that you can do with it. When you reverse cam with stiffness less than 1 and also drive, turning and accelerating will both make your car go in the opposite direction on your screen than they would with regular car cam. Also, toggling ball cam doesn't work, so when you try, your camera just weirdly bounces. Ever since I started playing Rocket League, there's been a burning question in the forefront of my mind. And that question is, what are the best camera settings? To some, this might seem like a trivial question. I plan to take you on a journey so that you may understand the amount of nuance that goes into answering a question like this, and hopefully provide some help for any of you deciding on your own settings. The first thing many people do when adjusting their settings is to copy a pro player's settings. This is a great idea as using a pro player's camera settings guarantees your cams will be viable for competitive gameplay. This is usually the end of the road for most players as they stick to very standard cams, and since adjusting them usually doesn't have much effect on their gameplay, they don't change. This would have been my story too if it weren't for one reason. I started freestyling. Before I started freestyling, I used 110, 260, 80, -2, 0.65. These settings are quite alright for competitive, and I would have been just fine with them if I had never begun grinding air dribbles. Infinite air dribbling is much easier with the low height, so I decided to use DLG's cams at the beginning, which were 110, 190, 60, 0, 1 at the time. After around 8 months of using those, I began learning chain resets, and I copied whatever my friend Safe was using at the time as we were grinding them together. My settings change often, but eventually I settled on 110, 160, 40, 0, 1. These are the cameras I hit the chain reset world record using. Over time, I realized I needed some alternative settings for when I wanted to do heli resets, spinning air dribbles, or just have a more typical view of my car. The secondary cameras I used during this time weren't notable until I got a crazy idea. Would it be possible to have one camera setting that could do every mechanic in the game so I would never need to switch? My first attempt at this was 110, 220, 70, -5, 1. I figured 1 stiffness was the best, and 70 height was as high as you could go while still being decent for infinite air dribbles. As time went on, I experimented and came to the conclusion that by and large, the lower your camera height the better. Eventually, I found 110, 200, 40, -15, 1. These were the first settings that I felt I could do everything in the game with. They were far enough for heli resets and spinning air dribbles, yet they were still close enough that they could chain an air dribble very well. At this point, I had camera settings that could do everything, but still I felt something was missing. The issue was the fact that these cams didn't look very good, and I didn't like using them for some things like dribbling. With this in mind, I experimented with finding cameras that looked better and were still just as good mechanically. Eventually, I found 110, 250, 40, -15, 0. I determined the distance increase and stiffness decrease were things I could get used to over time. I used these for a while, but there was one issue. Since the height was so low and the angle so far pitched down, this resulted in lots of space at the bottom of the screen that was just unused. Since this was a direct result of the camera height that kept my cams viable mechanically, this wouldn't be something that I could fix easily. Also, although I got pretty used to it, the 0 stiffness just didn't feel quite as solid. Though I could go back to a higher stiffness, I really liked the way these camera settings looked compared to the old 200 distance cams. I was at a crossroads and I had to reassess what I truly wanted. At first, I wanted to make one camera setting that could do every mechanic that still looked good, but no matter how hard I tried, mechanics turned out to be at the cost of the camera's aesthetics. Then I had a thought. Since you can access the camera settings screen from anywhere in the game, there's no reason I can't use 2 different cams and quickly switch between them whenever I needed to. It was with this thought that I decided to find 2 settings to use, one for mechanics and one for aesthetics. 1. The first cam would be as mechanical as possible. It would be as good looking as I could make it while still making no compromises with regards to mechanics. 2. The second cam would be for aesthetics, and it would be the best looking cam that I could make. I would try my best to make it capable of doing every mechanic in some capacity. 3. I'd make these camera settings as similar as possible so I can switch between them in the camera settings menu as quickly as possible. Any unnecessary differences will be removed. So, for the mechanical cams, obviously I would use 110 FOV and 1 stiffness, and for the aesthetic cams I would use 0 stiffness. I also found that using a low height with a low angle seems to look better than a low height with a high angle. Since low height is correlated pretty tightly with how mechanical a camera setting is, I decided I would use 0 angle. I liked the way this felt for mechanics too, so I decided to use 0 angle for both settings. The only things that remained were distance and height. I intended to use the same distance for both settings since distance doesn't have much effect on how good a cam is mechanically. After some trial and error, I decided to use 230/90 for the aesthetic cams, since the car is in a good position on the screen and also because they can infinite air dribble if I hold the camera swivel up button. Air dribbling with camera swivel is easiest with 90 height. Now all I had to decide was the height for the mechanical cams. I tried 70 for a bit, but 60 felt better for everything and still doesn't look too low when in ball cam. I didn't use 50 height as it felt a bit too low for resets. So after all that, I've decided on 110, 230, 60, 0, 1, 1, 1 as my mechanical cams, and 110, 230, 90, 0, 0, 1, 1 as my aesthetic cams. I've been using these since late June 2022, and I love everything about them. I've been trying to find good camera settings for a while, and I've spent many hundreds of hours tweaking these settings to find what I like best. I found what I feel are the best cams, and I just really wanted to share. I hope you found this video informative, and have a great rest of your day.